एवरीवन, आज हम करने वाले हैं बैकशॉट कंपनी। ये एक एथिक्स का सम है, तो चेक करते हैं इसको। एथिक्स कंपनी has a controlling interest in a number of entities. Group results have been disappointing in recent years, and the directors of Bagshot Company have been discussing various strategies to improve group performance. The current financial year end is 31st of December 15. So, the following personnel are relevant to this scenario: Mr. Shaw, head accountant of Bagshot; Mrs. Doyce, chief executive of Bagshot; Mike Starr, nephew of Mr. Shaw; Mrs. Shaw, wife of Mr. Shaw. Exhibits. Group structure. Mr. Shaw, an ACCA member, is the head accountant of Bagshot. He is not a member of the board of directors. The question क्या है? Discuss the appropriate accounting treatment of the restructuring costs in the financial statements of Bagshot for the year ended 31st of December 15. Mr. Shaw, an accountant and ACCA member, is the head accountant of Bagshot. He is not a member of the board of directors. Mrs. Doyce, the chief executive of Bagshot, is also an ACCA member. During December 2015, Mrs. Doyce revealed plans to Mr. Shaw of a potential restructure of the Bagshot Group, which had been discussed at the board meeting. The restructuring plans included a general analysis of expected costs which would be incurred should the restructure take place. These include legal fees, relocation costs for the staff, and also redundancy costs for a number of employees. One such employee to be made redundant, Mike Starr, is a nephew of Mr. Shaw. Mrs. Doyce is insistent that Mr. Shaw should include a restructuring provision for all the expenditure in the financial statements of Bagshot Company for the year ended 31st of December 15. Mr. Doyce argues even if the restructure did not take place exactly as detailed, similar levels of expenditure are likely to be incurred on alternative strategies. It would therefore be prudent to include a restructuring provision for all expenditure. None of the staff, other than Mr. Shaw, have been notified of the plans, although Mrs. Doyce has informed Mr. Shaw that she expects a final decision and public announcement to be made prior to the authorization of the financial statements. First of all, in accordance with IAS 37, provisions, contingent liability, and contingent asset. A provision is recognized when there is a present obligation as a result of past event, when outflow of economic resources is probable to take place, and the amount of expenditure can be reliably estimated. ये तीन चीजें जब होती हैं तब हम प्रोविजन बनाते हैं. A provision is either a legal obligation or a constructive obligation. Either of the two होता है. Um, um, huh. In the current scenario, we can see that Mrs. Doyce revealed the plans to Mr. Shaw of a potential restructure of the Bagshot Group during December 15, which we can estimate was before the year end, and which had been discussed at the board meeting. These plans had been discussed in the board meetings. फिर यही लाइन अपन कॉपी पेस्ट कर देंगे यहाँ पे कि द रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग प्लान्स इंक्लूडेड ग्रेट सॉरी जनरल एनालिसिस ऑफ एक्सपेक्टेड कॉस्ट, ये सब ब्ला ब्ला ब्ला, ये अपन कॉपी पेस्ट करके करके लिख देंगे. However, these costs included relocation cost. In accordance with IAS 37, it prohibits the recognition of provision where relocation costs are involved. मतलब हम relocation cost के लिए provision नहीं बना सकते. However, we can make provision for redundancy costs and legal costs for the number of employees if the amount of cost can be estimated reliably In the current scenario, we can see is instead of that Mr. Shaw should include a restructuring provision for all expenditure in the financial statements. Argues that even if restructure did not take place, Mr. Doyle's statement or insisting Mr. Shaw to include a restructuring provision for all the expenditure in the financial statements does not give a valid argument regarding what all expenditure includes. If this expenditure includes relocation costs or retraining costs, then such costs cannot then for such cost provision cannot be made. Thus, Mr. Shaw should only make up provision for the cost can be estimated reliably, and if they are allowed as per IAS 37, वो copy paste वापस एक बार IAS का नाम. Mr. Dawes, however, argued further that even if restructuring did not take place, exactly as detailed, similar level of expenditure are likely to be incurred on alternative strategies. These alternative strategies are not could necessarily not mean restructuring. And for such alternative strategies, there can be a condition where provision is not recognized. Thus, a more clarification should be brought on the fact of what does these alternative strategies mean. It would therefore be prudent to restructuring provision or expanding include all provision. Oh, ठीक है. None of the stuff other than Mr. Shaw have been notified of the plans, although Mr. Doyle has informed Mr. Shaw that she expects a final decision and public announcement to be made prior to the authorization. There you go. Mr. Doyle has informed Mr. Shaw that she expects a final decision and public announcement to be made prior to the authorization. However, announcement should be done prior to the reporting period. And if the authorization is not done as per in the prior reporting period, but is made after the reporting period or prior to the authorization, then only a non-adjusting event. Then it is only a non-adjusting event, and only a disclosure can be given in the financial statements. ये अपन बता देंगे. चेक करते हैं एक बार हमारे हाथ के साथ. देखो, सबसे पहली बात तो IAS 37 होता क्या, ये उन्होंने बता दिया. इन्होंने ये भी बोला है कि IAS 37 ये बोलता है कि इट इज एक्सट्रीमली रेयर दैट नो रिलायबल एस्टिमेट कैन बी मेड. A best estimate of expenditure required to settle present obligation should be provided as at 31st of December 15, should all criteria be met. In the case of restructuring provision, this should only include direct expenditure arising from the restructuring and not associated with the ongoing activities. Hence, the relocation cost would not be included, as although they relate directly to the restructuring, costs would be classified as ongoing activity. रिलोकेशन कॉस्ट जो है वो एक ऑनगोइंग एक्टिविटी भी माना जा सकता है ऐसा. इट इज नॉट क्लियर yet that restructuring payments are probable. Mrs. Doyce has indicated that alternative studies are possible and further clarification is required. Only then may be determined that such a restructuring payments are probable. अच्छा, हमें एक कंक्लूजन भी देना होता है, so we can conclude by saying कि thus a provision should not be made if further clarification from Mr. Doyce is not available. ऐसा अपन बता देंगे. ये देखो, a constructive obligation for restructuring only arises when a detailed formal plan exists and valid expectation to those affected by the restructuring that it will take place has occurred. A plan is in place, but management does not yet appear committed as alternative strategies are possible. It is unlikely, therefore, that the plan is detailed and specific enough for these criteria to be satisfied. For example, the specific expenditure to be incurred, the date of its implementation, and time frame, which should not be unreasonably long, must be identified within alternative strategies available. This does not appear to be the case. Furthermore, Mr. Shaw is the only member of staff who has been notified and no public announcement has been made at the report. तो ये भी अपन ने बोला था कि no public announcement has been made. Consequently, there is no obligation. तो इसकी वजह से कोई obligation नहीं है 31st of December 15 को, and thus no provision should be recognized. Mrs. Doyce has identified that a final decision on restructuring and communication is likely to take place before the financial statements are authorized. This would almost certainly make be a material event arising after the reporting date, but should not be treated but should be treated as a non-adjusting event. जो जैसा कि अपन ने बोला, accordingly, Bagshot company should disclose the nature of the restructuring and an estimate of the financial effect, but recognition for of a restructuring provision is still prohibited. तो अपन recognize फिर भी नहीं कर सकते. आगे बढ़ते हैं. Actually, I was here. I wanted to finish it from here. Discuss what is meant by good stewardship of a company and what the restructure and recognition of restructuring provision in the financial statements are examples of good stewardship. Okay, क्या होता है good stewardship and whether restructure and recognition of restructuring provision in the financial statements are good examples of good stewardship. तो सबसे पहले तो good stewardship means that the directors of the company are working in the best interest of the company, or those charged with governance are working in the best interest of the company. Um, they provide fair representation of the financial statements to the investors so that they can make their decisions about whether or not to invest in the company or should they invest the money elsewhere. Um, they act on behalf of the investors and provide them the fair presentation of financial statements. इतना बोल देंगे. Now, whether restructure and recognition of a restructuring provision in the financial statements are examples of good stewardship? No. The recognition of restructuring provision in the financial statements is not a good example of good stewardship as restructuring. अभी यही ऊपर के वो obligation के points copy कर लेंगे कि at the present date there was no obligation to create a provision and thus a provision should not be created. Also, there was doubt over what were the alternative strategies that would be used that for which the amount would be used वगैरह वो सब तो वो सब बता देंगे. Stewardship. Stewardship is an ethical principle which embodies the responsible planning and management of resources. The directors of Bagshot perform a good stewardship role in that they are appointed by the shareholders to manage Bagshot company on their behalf. The directors therefore assume responsibilities to protect the entity's resources from unfavorable effects of economic factors such as price and technological changes and to ensure that Bagshot complies with all laws, regulations, and contractual obligations. Group results have been disappointing in recent years, although no specific cause have been identified. It could be argued, therefore, that the restructure is acting in good faith and reflecting good principles of stewardship. It is anticipated that the long-term shareholder value will be enhanced from the proposals. अभी ये देखो, second factor of good stewardship is that it is important that investors, both existing and potential, and lenders have reliable and accurate information about the entities resources so that they can assess how efficiently and effectively the entities management and governing board have discharged their responsibilities. It is important, therefore, that the financial statements are transparent, objective, comply fully with the IFRS standards. अभी ये देखो, Mr. Doyce wants Bagshot to include a restructuring provision as at 31st of December 15, even though no obligation arises. While his prudence in a guiding principle when dealing with issues of uncertainty, excessive prudence cannot be justified. As a qualified member of ACCA, it should be apparent to Mrs. Doyce that no provision should be recognized and to include one would be misleading to the stakeholders of the Bagshot. तो जो भी अपन ने बोला वो बिल्कुल सही है, बस लास्ट में ये बोलना है कि जो कि if a provision is recognized then it would be misleading to the shareholders. हाँ, stakeholders बोला है उन्होंने, shareholders भी is fine. कुछ भी. आगे. Discuss briefly whether Mrs. Shaw's acquisition of equity shares in Bagshot should be disclosed as a related party transaction. Mrs. Shaw is the wife of Mr. Shaw, the head accountant of Bagshot. She is not an employee of Bagshot and does not know about the proposed restructure. However, Mrs. Shaw recently acquired 5% of equity shares in Bagshot. Mr. Shaw is considering informing his wife of the proposed restructure so that she can make an informed decision as to whether to divest her shareholding or not. Mr. Shaw is concerned that in the short term at least, the inclusion of any restructuring costs would be harmful to the profitability of Bagshot. It is also uncertain as to how the market may react should the restructure take place. It is, however, anticipated that the long-term shareholder value would be enhanced. Hmm. A related party transaction is a transaction with the party, a related party transaction. A related party transaction is a transaction wherein transfer of assets, services, or transfer of liabilities takes place, uh, regardless of the consideration being charged. A related party is a party which is in relation. A related party is a party which is in relation with the entity who is creating its financial statements for the year end. In the current scenario, we can see that Mrs. Shaw is the wife of Mr. Shaw, um, who is the head accountant of Bagshot. She recently acquired 5% of equity shares in Bagshot company. Um, if Mr. Shaw informs his wife of the proposed restructure, she can make an informed decision as to whether to divest her shareholding or not. Divest in the sense बढ़ाना ना. Hmm. So that she can divest her shareholding. Mr. Shaw already knows that if the restructuring costs are being एक मिनट ना, if the proposed restructure if the restructure takes place and the restructuring costs are incurred, then it would harm the profitability of Backshot in the current year. Uh, तो अभी के लिए वो अपना जो है प्राइस वो नीचे गिरेगा शेयर का बिकॉज रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग कॉस्ट हैव बीन इनकर्ड. इट वुड बी हार्मफुल for the profitability of Backshot, and thus we can say that the share price of Backshot can seem to go down. Thus, and it's also uncertain how the market can react should the restructure take place. Plus, there is a lot of uncertainty which revolves around the fact that how would the market react. So भले ही उसकी profitability नीचे गिरी है, but how will the market react उसके बारे में उसको मिस्टर शॉ को कोई आइडिया नहीं है. So because Mr. Shaw has no idea about how the market will react to the restructure should the restructure take place. However, all he knows that in the long term the shareholder value will be enhanced. Thus, if Mrs. Shaw thinks about divesting her shares in the present, with the knowledge that the proposed restructure is going to take place from Mr. Shaw, then even then it won't be treated as a related party transaction. बिकॉज एक तो कि मार्केट की इंफॉर्मेशन अवेलेबल नहीं है, मतलब कि मार्केट कैसे रिएक्ट करेगा. एंड दूसरा ये भी है कि जो अपन ने एक्वायर किया वो खाली 5% ही है, लेकिन वेरी नॉमिनल वैल्यू आई थिंक. बट वी हैव टू चेक फॉर दिस आंसर. Mrs. Shaw's acquisition of equity shares in Backshot would be deemed a related party transaction if the acquisition enabled her to control or have significant influence over Backshot. अच्छा, briefly explain whether acquisition of equity shares in Bagshot. तो ये सिर्फ रिलेटेड पार्टी ट्रांजैक्शन तब होता जब ये सिग्निफिकेंट इन्फ्लुएंस होता या फिर ये कंट्रोल होता, क्योंकि वो तीन जो रीजंस होते हैं रिलेटेड पार्टी ट्रांजैक्शंस के, वो उन्होंने उसके साथ इस चीज को लिंक किया हुआ है। आई जस्ट ओपन दैट चैप्टर का पॉइंट वो। हम्म, ये रहा। A person or a close member of the person's family is related to the reporting entity if that person has control or joint control over the reporting entity, has significant influence over the reporting entity, or is a key member of the key personnel of the reporting entity, or of a parent of the reporting entity. A person is a related party if of an entity that they control or have significant influence over. Mrs. Shaw has 5% interest, which is way below the threshold to exercise control. Mrs. Shaw has a holding of less than 20% of the voting power, and so it is very unlikely that she has significant influence over the entity. Bagshot Company's directors would be related parties of Bagshot. However, Mrs. Shaw is unaware of the proposed restructure, which suggests that she does not have a board position. Mrs. Shaw would be deemed to be a close friend of Mr. Close friend क्या बोलते हैं, एक मिनट, close family member वही Mrs. Shaw would be deemed to be a close family member of Mr. Shaw, and so would be a related party of Bagshot Company. If it was concluded that Mr. Shaw is a member of the key management person of the company, तो मिस्टर शॉ भी कोई कंपनी का की मैनेजमेंट पर्सनल नहीं था, क्योंकि पता है वो मतलब बोर्ड पे नहीं बैठ रहा था। ही वॉज नॉट सिटिंग ऑन द बोर्ड। हाँ, ही इज नॉट मेंबर ऑफ द बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स, तो मतलब वो भी कोई ज्यादा बड़ा आदमी नहीं है और इसके पास भी कोई ज्यादा ज्यादा बड़ी होल्डिंग नहीं है। Mr. Shaw is a head accountant of Bagshot, but it seems highly unlikely that he would be deemed to be a key management personnel. There is no evidence that he has authority and responsibility for planning, directing, and controlling the activities of Bagshot, nor does he appear to be a director of the entity. Based on the above, it can be concluded that Mr. Shaw's acquisition of 5% of equity in Bagshot Company is not related party transaction. Okay, my bad, क्योंकि what I thought was कि सिर्फ और सिर्फ ये जो ये 6 पैराग्राफ से उसके ऊपर अपने को आंसर बताना है। बट फिर भी ये 5% का पॉइंट अपने वो को क्लिक होना चाहिए था, एंड ऑल्सो दिस वाला पॉइंट। सो ठीक है, सो वी गॉट 643। वी हैव कंप्लीटेड 13 मार्क्स टिल नाउ। अभी लास्ट क्वेश्चन बचता है, वो है 7 मार्क्स का। Identify and discuss the ethical issues arising from the scenario which Mr. Shaw needs to consider and what actions he should take as a consequence. Hmm. So see, in the current scenario, Mr. Shaw, in the current scenario, we can see that Mr. Shaw is an ACCA member and a head accountant of Bagshot Company. Thus, being a ACCA member, he should be following the 5 basic principles of ACCA Code of Ethics, which are वो पांच: integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality and professional behavior. He's expected to follow um, these 5 basic principles. Even we can see that Mrs. Dawes, who's the chief executive of Bagshot Company, is also an ACCA member. So she should also be familiar and should follow these 5 basic ACCA Code of Ethics principles. In the recent years, we can see that the group results have been disappointing, and directors of Bagshot have been discussing various strategies to improve the group performance. Here, if Bagshot company operates in a competitive environment, then the chances of manipulating the financial results in order to provide a better financial image are is highly possible. Mrs. Dawes revealed the plans of potential restructure. ठीक है. In the current scenario, we can see that Mr. Shaw was asked by Mr. Doyce to create a, actually, Mrs. Doyce insistent that Mr. Shaw should include a restructuring provision for all expenditure of the financial statements for the year ended 31st of December 2015. ये वाला लाइन मैं बोल रहा हूँ, कब से वो पूरा सिलेक्ट हो रहा था. तो this line we will copy paste in the answer. Mr. Shaw should not be influenced by Mrs. Doy's request, and should only account for a provision if the conditions for recognizing a provision are met. That is, तो वो अपन IAS 37 से कुछ पॉइंट्स वैसे एक बार कॉपी पेस्ट कर लेंगे यहाँ पर. He should check whether all of these conditions are met. If yes, only then the provision should be recognized. uh, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Shaw, being the head accountant, is also assumed to know and understand the implications of various IFRS accounting standards. This describes his professional behavior. This describes or explains his professional competence in his work. Um, ये देखो, एक तो ना, none of the staff other than Mr. Shaw. ये Mr. Shaw has been notified of the plans, although Mr. Doyce has informed Mr. Shaw as she expects a final decision to be made in the public. Okay. लेकिन ये देखो, मिस्टर शॉ का एक नेफ्यू भी था. वन सच एम्प्लॉय टू बी मेड रिडंडेंट, माइक स्टार, इज अ नेफ्यू ऑफ मिस्टर शॉ. तो मिस्टर शॉ को सबसे पहले, तो ये जो नेफ्यू है, ये पूरे गेम में कभी आया ही नहीं है पूरे अपने आंसर्स में. तो अभी ये आएगा कि देखो, बाकी सारे एम्प्लॉयज को इंफॉर्मेशन बाद बाद में मिल रही है. द अदर एम्प्लॉयज वुड गेट द इंफॉर्मेशन about the redundancy at a very later date. That is, that is when the public announcement has been made prior to authorization of the financial statements. However, as Mr. Shaw is the only one who has been notified about the plans of restructure, he might, transfer this information to his nephew, Mike Starr, and thus Mike Starr can take advantage of this information and start finding jobs elsewhere. उसके बाद और क्या लिख सकते हैं? Thus, in this scenario, the principle of confidentiality gets tested, whether Mr. Shaw is able to keep this information to himself, or keep the information of restructuring confidential. This confidentiality test can further also be tested when, फिर ये मिस्टर शॉ इज कंसर्न, ये जो वाइफ है ना, उसको इंफॉर्मेशन देनी चाहिए कि नहीं, उधर भी इसकी कॉन्फिडेंशियलिटी टेस्ट होती है. Although Mrs. Shaw cannot actually have a huge impact by disposing of her shares in Bagshot, but still such information should be kept to himself, thus also describing his professional behavior towards his job. अभी ये 7 मार्क के लिए आया है, और इतना ही अपने को फिलहाल आया है आंसर में. इसमें और भी डाल सकते हैं कि इफ मिसेस डॉयज ट्राइज टू intimidate Mr. Shaw, or threatens her dependent, or threatens her, actually threaten नहीं कर सकती about the salary, because वो एक हेड अकाउंटेंट है, तो उसको सैलरी के लिए वो इतना थ्रेटन नहीं कर सकती. जूनियर होता तो कर पाते. सो आई डोंट नो, वो वाला पॉइंट डालना चाहिए कि नहीं. Should not get intimidated by Mrs. Doyce being a chief executive officer. Conclusion तो मुझे पता है मुझे क्या लिखना है, if कि Mr. Shaw should explain the implications of not recognizing or recognizing the restructuring provision to Mrs. Doyce. If Mrs. Doyce is still insistent that Mr. Shaw should still include a restructuring provision, then Mr. Shaw should discuss this matter with the other board of directors. If he cannot seek help from the other board of directors, then he should report this matter to the ACC helpline. If the matters are still not resolved, and if the matters are still not resolved, and एक्चुअली वांट टू से वो स्टैंडर्ड रेजिग्नेशन का पॉइंट की मतलब वो स्टैंडर्ड पॉइंट है एक्चुअली रेजिग्नेशन का। हाउएवर मैं ये सोच रहा हूँ कि इतनी बड़ी कोई बात हुई नहीं है लाइक रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग को लेके। सो बोलने तो बोल सकते हैं कि the last option that Mr. Shaw should keep if if he cannot seek help or the issue is not resolved, then it is resignation. However, शायद अपन ये पॉइंट ऐड कर देते कि however, by looking at the current scenario, the seriousness of the current scenario, we can say that resignation, that the call for resignation is far in the future, like or is very less probable, ऐसा मतलब नहीं हो सकता ऐसा, वी कैन से। चेक कर लेते हैं एक बार इनका आंसर। Ethics. Mr. Shaw is facing a number of ethical dilemmas arising from the scenario. Mrs. Doyle's insistence that a restructuring provision should be included could constitute an intimidation threat to objectivity, although her motivation for including a provision early is unclear. Mr. Shaw is also a qualified member of ACCA, therefore should be aware of the treatment and inconsistent treatment is inconsistent with the international accounting standards. Mr. Shaw must adhere to ACCA Code of Ethics and prepare the financial statements diligently, which are objective and fully comply with IFRS standards. He must not comply with Mrs. Doyle's request and should politely remind her of her professional responsibilities as a member of the ACCA. Non-compliance with accounting standards would be a breach of a range of ethical principles, including professional competence, professional behavior, and objectivity. Assuming that Mrs. Doyce is aware of the error, her integrity would also, हाँ अपन मिसेस डॉयस के ऊपर भी डाल सकते हैं कि अगर मिसेस डॉयस को पता है तो फिर वो उसकी इंटेग्रिटी के ऊपर भी सवाल उठ जाता है। एंड शी इज नॉट प्रोवाइडिंग अ फेयर रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट्स टू द इन्वेस्टर्स, ये भी बोल सकते हैं। Mr. Shosh could be accused of insider trading where he to inform his wife of the proposed restructure. Barabar. Insider trading involves the use of non-publicized information in order to make decision on the financial investments based on the information which others do not yet know about. तो अपन ने insider information नहीं बोला, अपन ने उस चीज को ऐसे बोला कि उस मिस्टर शॉ की कॉन्फिडेंशियलिटी टेस्ट होती है कि वो अपने वाइफ को बताएगा कि नहीं। अपन ने ऐसे बताया था, बट इंसाइडर ट्रेडिंग इज अ मच बेटर पॉइंट। It is clear that such behavior would not be ethical since Mrs. Shaw would be in an advantageous position to make investment decisions which would impact unfairly on the other stay shareholders. Insider traders have information which others do not have, such that other stakeholders may act differently and make different decisions should they have been privy of the same information. Such activities are seen as fraudulent and are likely to be in breach of local money laundering regulations. Mr. Shaw has become privy to confidential information regarding Bagshot Company. One of ACCA's key ethical principles is that of confidentiality. Information must not be disclosed to others unless there is a legal or professional right or duty to disclose. Professional accountants must also ensure that they do not use confidential information for their personal benefit. Mr. Shaw has self-interest threat arising both from his wife ownership of the shares, हाँ उसको अपने सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट नहीं बोला, एक्चुअली ये सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट भी है ना क्योंकि वाइफ का पैसा उसी का पैसा हो गया, and from his nephew facing potential redundancy. His wife could use the information to consider whether she may wish to sell her 5% ownership interest. Mr. Shaw may also feel pressure to inform his nephew of the potential redundancy he may be facing. This may allow his nephew to obtain an unfair advantage over few employees by, for example, examining other opportunities in the labor market. Mr. Shaw must not disclose the confidential information to his wife or nephew. ये अपन ने वाइफ और नेफ्यू का थोड़ा बहुत कवर किया था, अच्छा खासा। लेकिन ये इंसाइडर ट्रेडिंग का पॉइंट अपन ने बिल्कुल भी नहीं बोला था। ये इंसाइडर ट्रेडिंग का पॉइंट जस्ट हमको याद रखना है लास्ट में। ठीक है।